Genghis Khan conquered more territory in 25 years than Rome did in 400. But his empire survived only 3 generations after his death because the Mongols never solved one problem. What do you do when there's nothing left to conquer? By 1279, the Mongol Empire controlled 12 million square miles, one continuous landmass stretching from Korea to Hungary, 110 million people under a single authority. Then, in less than a century, it tore itself apart. Not from outside enemies, but from the same forces that made it unstoppable. Not conquered, not overthrown by rebellion. It tore itself apart. And here's what nobody tells you. The same system that let a nomadic people from the steppes build the largest contiguous empire in human history, that exact system guaranteed it would collapse the moment expansion stopped. The question isn't why the Mongol Empire fell. The question is why an empire built on perpetual motion thought it could survive standing still. Let's put numbers to this. In 1206, Genghis Khan unified the Mongol tribes, roughly 1 million people. By 1227, when he died, the empire covered 4.5 million square miles. His grandson Mongol Khan, between 1251 and 1259, he added another 3 million square miles. That's the size of the United States conquered in 8 years. Mongol armies covered 60 miles a day on horseback. No European army would move that fast again until they had tanks and trucks. Reconnaissance units covered 100 miles per day. The YAM system, their postal relay network, could deliver a message from Beijing to the Caspian Sea in 6 weeks. In 1240. For context, a letter from London to Rome took 3 months. They conquered Baghdad in 1258, destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate that had stood for 500 years, took the city in 12 days. But by 1294, just 36 years later, the empire had fractured into 4 separate Khanates that would spend the next century fighting each other. And here's where it gets strange. They didn't lose a single major war during that collapse. No outside enemy broke them. The machine just stopped working. Because the real question is this: can you build an empire on movement, adaptation, and conquest, and then ask it to govern in place? In the next 12 minutes, we're going to trace how the Mongol Empire became a victim of its own success. How every innovation that made conquest possible became a structural weakness the moment there was nothing left to conquer. You'll see how a succession crisis in 1241 stopped the Mongols from conquering Western Europe when they were 3 days' ride from Vienna. How religious tolerance, their greatest PR achievement, created loyalty problems they never solved. And how the Mongol Empire's final irony wasn't that it fell, but that it succeeded so completely it made itself obsolete. By the end, you'll understand why the fastest-built empire in history couldn't survive 3 generations, and why that pattern is playing out again, right now, in ways most people aren't seeing. History is an open book. Watch as we turn the pages. To understand the collapse, you need to understand what the Mongols actually built. Because this wasn't Rome. This wasn't a centralized bureaucracy with provincial governors and tax collectors. This was something entirely different. The Mongol military system was designed for one thing: speed. Every warrior maintained 3 to 5 horses. They could cover 60 miles a day with full equipment, triple what European armies managed. They didn't need supply lines because they brought their food with them: dried meat, fermented mare's milk. An army that could live off what it carried could move faster than any enemy could respond. But here's what made them different from every other empire. The command structure was radically decentralized. Genghis Khan divided his forces into units of 10. 10 men reported to a leader. 10 of those units, 100 men, reported to the next level. 10 of those, 1,000 men, to the next. All the way up to tumens, units of 10,000. Each commander had near total tactical autonomy. As long as they achieved their objective, they could adapt to local conditions however they wanted. No waiting for orders from the top. No rigid battle plans. This is how they conquered China, Persia, and Russia simultaneously. Different armies, different continents, different enemies, all operating independently under a shared strategic vision. And it worked because they were conquering. Stay with me here. The system required constant expansion for a specific reason: rewards. Mongol commanders weren't paid salaries. They were given shares of conquered territory. Loot. Tribute. The empire ran on the promise that if you fought well, you'd get land and wealth, which meant the empire needed new land to distribute. They also developed something unprecedented: strategic religious tolerance. When they conquered Muslim territories, they exempted Islamic scholars from taxes. Conquered Christians? Same deal for priests. Buddhists, Taoists, didn't matter. Genghis Khan's legal code, the Yasa, made religious persecution punishable by death. This wasn't enlightenment. This was pragmatism. Religious tolerance meant fewer rebellions. It meant local elites would collaborate instead of resist. But, and this is the part nobody talks about, it also meant the empire never developed a unifying ideology beyond conquest itself. Rome had Roman citizenship. Islam had the caliphate. The Mongol Empire had victory. That was the glue. By 1241, the Mongols had reached the gates of Vienna. Europe was in panic. Mongol scouts were raiding into Austria and Italy. Then, in December, Ogedei Khan, Genghis Khan's third son and chosen successor, died in Karakorum. Every Mongol army, everywhere, stopped. Because the Yasa required all princes and commanders to return to Mongolia for the Kurultai, the assembly that would elect the next great Khan. Batu Khan, commanding the invasion of Europe, turned his entire army around and rode 4,000 miles back to the Mongolian homeland. Europe was saved by a funeral. But here's what that moment revealed. The empire had no system for succession beyond gather everyone and vote. And when your empire spans 8,000 miles, gathering everyone takes years. The Kurultai to elect Ogedei's successor didn't happen until 1246. 5 years of paralysis. 5 years of rival princes positioning for power. 5 years when the machine of conquest sat idle. And in that gap, something fundamental changed. The commanders who'd been promised land and plunder, they started governing the territories they'd conquered. They stopped being generals and became kings. They married local nobility, converted to local religions, built palaces instead of planning campaigns. The Mongol Empire was becoming several empires, and nobody noticed until it was too late. Remember the question from the beginning? What do you do when there's nothing left to conquer? The Mongols never answered it, because by 1260 they'd hit the limits of what could be conquered. To the east, the Pacific Ocean. To the south, the jungles of Southeast Asia, where their cavalry was useless, and the Delhi Sultanate, which defeated them 3 times. To the west, they'd tried to invade Japan in 1274. The invasion fleet was destroyed by a typhoon, the kamikaze, divine wind. They tried again in 1281 with 4,400 ships and 140,000 men, another typhoon. The largest amphibious assault in history until D-Day, and it failed. To the northwest, heavily forested Europe, where cavalry tactics didn't work and castles were too strong to take quickly. By 1260, the Mongols controlled everything from Korea to Poland. They'd conquered more territory in 50 years than Rome did in 500. And that's when they hit a wall they couldn't break through. And the moment expansion stopped, every structural weakness became visible. First, succession. Between 1260 and 1264, the empire fought its first civil war, the Toluid Civil War, Kublai Khan versus Arik Boka, 2 grandsons of Genghis, both claiming the title of Great Khan. Kublai won, but the cost was permanent fracture. The Western Khanates, the Golden Horde controlling Russia, the Ilkhanate controlling Persia, refused to recognize Kublai's authority. They held their own Kurultais, elected their own Khans. The empire was now 4 empires, and they started fighting each other. Between 1262 and 1266, the Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate went to war over Azerbaijan, Mongols killing Mongols over territory that used to be unified. The same decentralized command structure that made conquest efficient now made unified governance impossible. Because here's the structural problem. The Mongol system rewarded individual commanders with autonomy and wealth. It was designed for expansion. But governance requires centralization. It requires commanders to follow orders even when it's not in their personal interest. It requires loyalty to an institution, not just to a successful general. The Mongols never built that institution. Second weakness, religious tolerance. When they were conquering, it was brilliant, but when they stopped moving, it became a crisis. Kublai Khan, ruling China from Beijing, converted to Buddhism to legitimize his rule over Chinese subjects. His cousin Ghazan, ruling Persia, converted to Islam in 1295 for the same reason, to be accepted by Persian elites. Berke Khan of the Golden Horde had already converted to Islam in 1252. Now you had Mongol Khans of different religions ruling different parts of the empire. And religion brought different laws, different allies, different enemies. When Ghazan converted to Islam, he made an alliance with the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt, the same Mamluks who defeated the Mongols at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260. Mongols were now allied with the enemies of other Mongols. When they were conquering, letting people keep their religions and customs kept them from rebelling. But now that same tolerance meant nobody felt Mongol. Chinese subjects identified as Chinese, Persian subjects as Persian. There was no shared identity holding the empire together. Third weakness, meritocracy without dynasty. The Mongol system promoted based on ability, not birth. Brilliant for building an army, catastrophic for political stability. Because when a Khan died, there was no automatic heir. Every succession was a negotiation. Every negotiation was a potential civil war. And every civil war weakened the empire further. By 1304, the four Khanates had stopped even pretending to be one empire. They signed a peace treaty with each other, as separate states. The Yuan dynasty in China fell in 1368 to the Ming Rebellion. The Ilkhanate collapsed into civil war in 1335. The Chagatai Khanate fractured into eastern and western halves. The Golden Horde lasted the longest, until 1502, but by then it controlled a fraction of its former territory. From unified empire to nothing in 90 years. But, and this is what most people miss, the collapse wasn't a failure of the Mongol system. It was the system working exactly as designed in the wrong context. Decentralization, tolerance, meritocracy, these worked perfectly for conquest. They failed completely at governance. And the Mongols never adapted because adaptation required giving up the very things that made them powerful. So here's the partial answer to our opening question. You can't survive standing still when your entire system is designed for motion. But that raises a harder question. Is this a Mongol problem or a problem with any system built on perpetual growth? Let's talk about 2008. The global financial system nearly collapsed because the world's largest banks had built business models that required continuous growth. Mortgage-backed securities worked as long as housing prices kept rising. The moment growth stopped, the system revealed it had no mechanism for stability. Sound familiar? Or take venture capital. In 2023, venture-backed startups raised $285 billion globally. The model requires companies to grow at 20 to 30% annually, every year, forever, which is mathematically impossible. Eventually, you run out of new markets, new customers, new territory to expand into. But only 10% of startups ever become profitable. The other 90% either fail or get acquired, which is just a polite word for absorption by something bigger. The system works brilliantly during expansion. It collapses during consolidation. China's Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2013, is literally rebuilding the Mongol trade routes. 152 countries, $1 trillion in infrastructure investment, and it's hitting the exact same problem the Mongols did. How do you maintain unity across that much territory with that many different political systems? Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Kenya have all defaulted on Belt and Road loans. The decentralized structure that made rapid expansion possible is now creating debt crises that Beijing can't control without looking like a colonial power. Or look at the European Union. 27 countries, unified currency, free movement, all built on the assumption of continuous economic growth and expansion. But since the 2008 crisis, growth has stalled. And now you have member states, Hungary, Poland, openly defying EU governance while still taking EU funds. The tolerance and decentralization that made expansion possible are now preventing unified policy. The pattern is everywhere once you see it. Systems optimized for growth become fragile the moment growth stops. And the strategies that enable rapid expansion, decentralization, flexibility, tolerance of difference, become vulnerabilities during consolidation. The Mongol Empire didn't fall because it was weak. It fell because it was perfectly adapted to the wrong phase of its existence. And it couldn't adapt because adaptation would have required becoming something it wasn't. Every empire has a story. The unexpected twist in the Mongol story is that they didn't fail. They succeeded so completely they made their own system obsolete. So here's the answer to the question we opened with. What do you do when there's nothing left to conquer? You either build institutions that can survive without growth, or you fracture into pieces that can. The Mongols chose fracture. Not consciously, not as a decision, but because their system had no mechanism for the choice. And the real legacy of the Mongol Empire isn't the conquest. It's the proof that perpetual motion machines don't exist, not in physics and not in empires. The Mongol collapse raises an obvious next question. Has any empire ever successfully transitioned from expansion to stability? The answer is yes, exactly once. And the way they did it changed the structure of global power for 400 years. That's the next video. If you want to understand how one empire solved the problem that destroyed the Mongols, you'll want to see what comes next.